He's Howard Ibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Henry, we're back with another episode. Today, we have 2 women, one from Madrid, one from the West Coast. Their names are Christine Olivas and Cynthia Abad Mancheño. They run a company called No Single Individual. Uniquely, they are a collection of strategists who work directly with ad agencies. It's a pretty cool concept. Let's join the conversation. Okay. Well, Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers. Today, we are graced by the presence of 2 young ladies, both of whom are part of a company called No Single Individual. I came across Christine Olivas on LinkedIn, which is where Henry and I like to find our guests and interesting people. Christine and one of her partners, Cynthia Abad Mancheño, are strategists. No Single Individual is a company devoted to working in strategy. They work, I think, almost exclusively with ad agencies. They might make an exception here or there. So Christine and Cynthia, Henry and I are delighted to have you. Welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So now, Christine, where are you coming from? Where are you talking to us from?
Yep. So I'm currently based in Tacoma, Washington.
Okay,
but via Arizona, Philly, New York, Miami, San Francisco, Vegas, many other places. So I've lived in a lot of cities, but this is our latest stomping ground.
Okay, Christine is on the West Coast and Cynthia is calling in from Madrid. So we're covering quite a few time zones. So one of the things that really fascinated me about talking to you, I'll confess that it's kind of a narrow approach, but it's something that I want you to address, and then we will eventually expand on that, which was the fact that you offered strategic advice and counsel to ad agencies. And as I first came across you, it was an assembly of women-only strategists, which I thought was pretty cool. But before we get into that, we'd like to invite our guests to give us a little bit of a background of how you found your way to advertising. Was it a direct path? Was it a circuitous path? What got you into, what attracted you to advertising, and how did you make your way to where you are today? So give us a little bit of a background. Christine, why don't we start with you?
Times 2, yeah.
Times 2. We'll start with Christine and then hear from Cynthia.
Sounds good. Yeah. So my path to advertising initially would be liberal arts degree, law school dropout, which 20 years later does serve me in some ways as a business owner. We can talk about that some other time. Then to startups. So upon leaving law school after a few semesters, I did the old drop-off resumes at startups that people actually used to do, pre-LinkedIn era, and caught the eye of a particular startup called AdBreak. It was one of the first online advertising networks, eventually bought by Yahoo, and other parts were bought by Google to kind of form the ad algorithm we know today. Had progressive roles in startups as a VP of marketing, including some small Series A startups in New York, and then ended up sort of randomly through a webinar friend that I made a connection making my way to the agency side. I started in a small agency, regional agency. So I led both client services and strategy. So kind of got to see the account and strategy side of things. And then I was recruited to an agency in New York, had 3 full-time agency roles in New York, and then went freelance in early 2017 and started to form Co-Conspirators, what is now No Single Individual, mid-2020. So sort of early pandemic. And we're in our 4th year now. So law school, dropout, to startups, to advertising, to freelancing and business owner. So somewhat circuitous, but not as windy as I sometimes used to think when I looked at my own path.
It's really not as uncommon as you might think. When Henry and I asked this question of other guests who are, creatives or CMOs or anything in that area, except for some young people today who are discovering advertising programs in college or in portfolio schools, who are taking a direct path, people who are a little older, like me and like Henry, we didn't find our way until I was 30. Henry was probably about the same age.
I was 26 when I took my first advertising job.
Yeah, it's not unusual. Cynthia, what about you? Tell us your route to this industry.
Sure. So I would say I'm an older person who found it at a young age in a university program. I was a student at Michigan State University, and we had a great advertising program. And I was involved in the AAF there, which has an undergrad competition. So I got really involved in the competition. We won, just got really, really into the whole idea of advertising, heard about account planning, as it was called back then, and got really lucky because I was in AAF. I was then connected with lots of agencies and got a job before I graduated, actually. So I moved to Detroit and worked on, Chevy at Campbell Ewald. I worked on Cadillac at Leo Burnett, and just had a really great, fun, start to being an account planner, data analyst, all that good stuff. And then started to expand outside of the automotive industry, and have since, gone, gosh, pretty much any industry, you name it, I've worked on it. So yeah, so I was
You work in Detroit, or you work in LA, and you're going to be working on an automotive account. That's just kind of a de facto thing. So for both of you, was account planning or strategy first choice? Is that really what you wanted to do, or did you test the waters in other areas?
No, I was 100% about strategy. I had heard about this idea of trend hunting. I had heard about, anthropologists coming in and doing these, pure observational insight market research projects. And I was just completely fascinated and in love with the whole idea of it. And when I first got into the business, a lot of my first bosses were coming out of London. So there was kind of that classic, account planner training that I had early on. So I loved the discipline, and just have found it to be really fulfilling.
Christine, would you say the same? Were you pretty laser focused on strategy, or did you find your way to it?
Not as much. And even today, I would consider it my first love, just because I came to advertising, after 12, a mid-level career in startups and in a more integrated in-house marketing roles. So I was the one pushing strategy at a lot of those startups and saying, hey, let's not just send that one email. Let's not race to launch a product until we do X, right? So in some way, shape, or form, I was doing strategy and sort of that pushing it on, the other startup executives, or trying to get buy-in from the board to buy, let's say, time from an agency to do a small audit, because we didn't have huge budgets, things like that. So I was a strategy advocate, I would say, before I was actually doing it. And then in the agency world, like I mentioned, because I started with a 5-year stint at a regional agency that didn't have a formal strategy discipline, sort of there, once again, I was the one who said, hey, we've got client services, we have creative, we have production, we're missing this other piece. So I don't know if I necessarily fell in love with it so much as just intuitively knew it was missing from a lot of the environments that I was in. And then it was a natural fit, once I got those New York roles and began freelancing to put myself in that spot. Although I did do a little bit of account management as well when I was freelance, and I still do like the client relationship side of things.
That's kind of my background as well. I mentioned I was 26 when I got my first advertising job, but really didn't find strategy till I was about 30, about 4 years in, and I was at a small creative boutique, and we had no account planning practice, and I realized it was missing. And by virtue of the fact that I was the one that realized that it was missing, I think it kind of made me qualified to be the one to lead it. So that was the beginning of a strategy career that now is about 24 years out of my 28 in the business. But yeah, it's
Henry,
amazing how. What's that?
I was going to tell the ladies that you're only 35, but you didn't give me a chance. So it's sorry.
I was about I think it is interesting how to figure out, like, somebody's in the agency is asking, well, the client is saying we got to do this, and I would be like, but why are we going to do that? Like, what are they ultimately trying to achieve? And maybe there's a better way, or there's other ways, or we can sell them other ways of achieving their goals. It's just interesting to me that that there were some agencies at that point in time, after planning was already a thing, you know, in the UK and even in the US, that there were still a lot of agencies that were resistant or didn't have. They were basically just creative vendors, like, here, make me a print ad, make me a radio commercial, and there wasn't much strategic thought beyond that.
So, you know, I've been a freelancer for a long time, off and on. And it's one thing to step out of the agency world and be, you know, go into freelance. It can be an easy transition for some, but to launch a business, that's an entirely different thing. And that's a courageous thing that you've done, and kind of a scary thing, I'm sure. What motivated you? Was there some event that happened that says, I think it's time to start a company? Tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess it was about 3.5 years of freelance. Of Cynthia is much more of a seasoned freelancer and has seen all the different sort of waves. When I started, it was just before the kind of pandemic push where people were doing it, let's say because they had to, because of job circumstances, or because it was more natural fit for working remote or what have you. So it's just, there is some research around the waves of freelancing. And so technically it would be like the second or third wave, right? So not the first people who were like yourselves went out on their own a long time ago, but starting to be a conversation among marketing folks and strategists. So I did it for 3.5 years and found myself to be surprisingly skilled at the business development side of things, which I wasn't expecting. And I had business development responsibilities at previous agency roles. I had managed a sales team as some of my VP of marketing roles at startups, but I was never the one actually getting on the phone or getting the meetings or doing that type of thing or utilizing my network. I was the one working on pitches like most of us, you know, do. Or maybe working with existing clients on renewals, which is, I think, a very different skill set. So I found myself pretty successful, and I kept thinking, oh, this volume of work will go down once the pandemic hits, and it didn't. It just continued to go up. So I decided to start ethically subcontracting and essentially going out and finding other folks in the space, women that I knew or had recently been introduced to, or had met along the way, and said, look, I've got this work. I would love if you tackled the upfront 6 C's. I would love if you know, helped me to do another pass at the deck, or even I have this client, do you want to do discovery with them? And then I'll do this piece. And just sort of started to build this kind of hub and spoke model. And that's part of the reason why I resisted the term collective early on so much, because collectives don't necessarily function in this sort of vertically integrated way where you're taking pieces. It's more like, hey, let's come together and try to figure out if we can get work together. I already had the work. It was just a question of whether I passed that to someone else and didn't make money off of it, or if I could sort of bring it all into the fold and try to create some sort of revenue model out of that. So that's how it started in 2020. And then by the time we got to the end of the year, a few of the other folks, Susan, who isn't on the podcast today, but Susan and I both living in Philly at the time, and decided to make this a formal thing. We launched 1/1/21, and then within 6 months had completely sort of solidified our offering to just teams. So always freelancing teams versus solo folks, and then focusing on agencies instead of direct brands. And again, there were some direct brands thrown in the mix, and startups from our past, some small, you know, brands here and there, but it was pretty clear early on that that's where the sweet spot was for us.
What's the typical agency need? Is it for a pitch? Is it for just overflow work that they don't have the in-house personnel for? Is it for categories that they maybe don't have experience in that you guys? I'm just trying to figure out, like, what is the need fulfilled for on behalf of agencies.
Sure, I think Cynthia could take. You want to take that one?
Sure. Gosh, you know what? There's no typical, I'll tell you that. They come to us with every scenario that you just listed. We, you know, so the other thing I want to hit on is what Christine mentioned is the team model. So typically when they come to us with these needs, it may even be something that they're not 100% sure what they need. They know they need help. They've reached their capacity in some way. And so they bring us in, and then they talk to us a little bit about what the issues are. It's not so often that it's an exact, here are the 5 things that I need from you. It's usually more of a conversation that we have with them, and then we tell them, we think that this, and this can help you. And we kind of talk through that. And then we put the team together based on whatever the specific needs are that that client has. So maybe it's people with specific social expertise, or maybe it's people who do have a specific category background. Maybe it's because they need a really senior person who can interface with the client and sort of take on some of those meetings. So it really varies. Sometimes we're sort of white labeled, and then other times we're introduced as a partner. Other times we just work really directly with the people at the agency. And yeah, pitches for sure. All kinds of things. Sometimes it's also a pitch and, oh, now we won the business, help. So we can continue on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like the natural, like that's like the dream, right? Like you kind of are responsible for the pitch, you win it, and then of course, who's gonna manage and caretake this thing from a strategy standpoint afterwards? That's like a win-win-win across the board. Are these typically like regional agencies, maybe
No,
that don't have as big built out strategy departments, or is it everything run the gamut?
That was, I mean, you're leading right into my next question, Henry. That's really a good transition. These are not little 10, 15, 20 person agencies, that you hear about. This is Deutsch. This is Day. These are major shops, and I'm impressed as hell. I mean, this is a freelance creative team's dream opportunity. And now I'm seeing this now for strategy, and maybe it's nothing new. It's new to me. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems like, are you breaking ground here? Is this something that you find are you competing with other independent strategy companies such as yourselves, or fill us in?
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, as experienced strategists, you can never be fully sure that you are the only one, even if you search for hours on, LinkedIn and talk to all your customers, right? You can only do a competitive audit so far before, and with the way that things are cropping up every single day, who knows? But I would say as of today, we have some, what I would call indirect competitors. As of founding in the first few years, we absolutely were the only ones to do this for strategy. And it was when we got pushback, like, hey, why do we need two people? And it's like, well, why do you need a CD and AD? Or why do you need a CD and AD and a writer? And that's part of the problem with strategies. We all have the same parallel, sort of titles, and we've gone back and forth with how to even call ourselves. We decided to just keep it simple. We're all strategists or strategy leads. We kept it simple for purposes of our team model, but for all intents and purposes, it's a similar makeup. You might have somebody who's really outstanding at interfacing with a client. Cynthia's an excellent strategist and really good with clients, so she might play one role, but then you have someone who's maybe not the most charismatic presenter, for example, or doesn't like to present that much, but does the most beautiful strategy decks you've ever seen, right? And those are completely different skill sets. So to be able to bring that sort of brain trust or combination to agencies is needed, and it's definitely new. And something's new when you got a lot of pushback, or people say they don't get it. They didn't understand for strategy. Why can't you just like marketers, why can't you just have one person and have them do it all? And we sort of found quickly that wasn't working. And I think the agencies that have 50 plus agencies that have worked with us now see the value. There are some competitors that cropped up in terms of like forming teams in the strategy and marketing space over the last few years, without naming names, but they all work directly with brands. And I would wager a guess, again, based on my just competitive review, the majority of their revenue is coming from brands, not from agencies, because agencies want to feel like you are working with them and that you understand them. And they also don't want you to contract with their clients at the same time as you contract with them. So I think our focus, sort of, which may have seemed short-sighted at the time, has actually turned out to be a good thing for our agency clients.
I think this is brilliant. I mean, I think the model of a team-based approach is brilliant. I teach creative brief writing, and one of the things that I pound into the trainees, who tend to be almost always, but not exclusively, marketers, is that we know that you as marketers don't write briefs more than, maybe 3, 4, 5 times in a year. You don't write that many briefs. Whereas Henry, either directly or through his direct reports, will write many, many briefs. So how do you do it well when you don't do it very often? You collaborate with either a fellow marketer who can, someone to bounce your ideas off of. Ideally, get a creative involved. Henry never does a brief without consulting his creative director. So why not pair up with a fellow strategist? 2 heads are better than 1. I mean, you can get it to be too big, right? You know, the old joke, what is a camel? It's a horse put together by a committee, when we don't want that. But this is what really attracted me to you when I found you on LinkedIn. I didn't know it at the time, but I do now, that you're a pioneer. You and Cynthia and your colleagues are pioneers in setting up this service for agencies. We're supposed to know how to do this pretty well, but you know, don't always. That's just between you and me. I won't tell anybody else. Do you no, go ahead, Cynthia.
I was just going to say, that's why I was attracted to it when I heard about it and really wanted to be a part of it. And it's a huge benefit because, as Christine mentioned, I've freelanced for a long time, but to have a team of people that you can go back and talk to, and sometimes when we have pushback from somebody who doesn't understand the model, like Christine was saying, you know, we talk about, look, you're going to get multiple people working on this one problem, and you're not paying for multiple people. So it's really a benefit to you. Also, we can work so quickly, so efficiently. It's a win-win around, you know, all for everybody.
Creatives.
One of the things that maybe people that don't work in strategy at agencies don't realize is the strategy or account planning department in an agency is usually the smallest department. I mean, when everybody is overcommitted in terms of like their hours. So the idea of having like a go-to A team of people outside that you can rely on when needed and not have to pay for those full-time employees on your you know, scope of work or whatever all the time is definitely something there's a value proposition there to agencies. Because honestly, to hire a really good strategist, I mean, you're talking about a big chunk of money plus all the other associated costs with having an employee, right? So from a business standpoint, it makes sense, particularly on clients where, you know, some clients have a very defined strategy cycle annually, right? And then the head of strategy could kind of just manage between those cycles. But when you have multiple clients in their planning for the upcoming year and you're like a head of strategy and you don't have a big department, it certainly, I would think, would be great to just be able to pick up the phone and say, hey, I have this, here's the parameters, let's go, and have the confidence to know it's going to get done, it's going to get done well.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think you hit the nail on the head with the size of the department, because I think a lot of the other, we're starting to see fewer of these objections, by the way, as folks adopt more fluid talent models, and there's a lot more talk about sort of great talent coming from anywhere and those types of things. But definitely at the beginning, in addition to the multiple people, it was like, well, we don't want to look bad. Like, we already have we have good strategists, not like our strategy is bad. Again, looking at the creative corollary, you don't think your creative team's bad because you bring on, you know, a creative team for a pitch. Either it's a bandwidth thing or it's fresh perspectives or what have you. And I would say, yes, there are a few of our clients who don't have formal, large strategy departments, or maybe even more than one person, but there are plenty that have decent sized strategy departments that are still using us, you know. So it's really a question of scaling. And then as work moves from more, you know, the inevitable cycle of retainer to project back to retainer, it's hard to stay on top of that as an agency and figure out the right long-term strategy hire to have when the type of work you have with the end client is changing so frequently. So right now we're living in a project world. It makes sense, but back 3 years ago when it was all retainers during the pandemic, it still made sense because there was margin in it. So trying to figure out some sort of a way to approach this that is resilient to kind of the ebbs and flows that the industry sees, which are many, as you know.
That's like the ebbs and flows are like death and taxes. They're inevitable.
Yeah.
Everything that we see is a pendulum swing. You know, we see it with big clients firing their agencies and going in-house, and then they fire their in-house agency and have a RFP. Like, just things become fashionable over time. They're always chasing the solution to whatever the problem is, and usually those solutions come in two flavors and we're swinging between them.
Yeah, getting back to that creative analogy, one of the things that I like is that the senior creatives, guys like George Tannenbaum like to say, and others mimic him, including me. You're not paying me by the hour. You're paying me for the decades of experience that I've acquired, which I can do more quickly. I can do in a day what a junior team might take a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks to do because my muscle memory is honed to it. So when you have two members that are in the presentation, but I don't know how many of you there are, 4 or 5 or 10 others in the background that you can huddle and do stuff with and bounce off ideas, that's a powerful, powerful advantage. So that leads me to the question, do you bring a particular school of thinking or philosophy to your strategy? Or are you flexible, or does it depend? Tell me about that.
Yes, it really does need to be based on what the agency's philosophy is. So, in a lot of ways, we're in a service business, which I personally like. I mean, it's not to say that I didn't have moments full time at New York agencies where I walked out of a meeting and we're like, yeah, we just presented to this CMO, and it was, you feel that energy. And I do like presenting, but I also never really loved the glory as much as knowing that I was part of something successful, which sounds cliche, but it's definitely more my personality. So I think we have to be sort of content with that. There isn't a lot of ego that we can, even if we wanted to, that we can bring to the table because we have several layers, right? We are, to Cynthia's point earlier, maybe our client is actually the CSO, or our client is the senior social strategist who just really needs help because their boss is on maternity leave or what have you. And our job is first and foremost to help them. Then after that, maybe we see the end client, maybe we don't. But because of that, first and foremost, we have to honor whatever the agency's kind of process is, their ideology. Are they the type that likes to work quickly and sort of just figure it out and brief and brainstorm at the same time? Do they want to follow a more classic, sort of series of weeks type of thing? Do they have a wheel that they use? Do they have their own version of the C's? That comes first and foremost. That said, as our clients get to know us, or if they really are coming to us in the first place because they want a new perspective, they will say, hey, have you ever seen it done this way? Or is there another way to do journeys besides awareness, engagement, conversion, and loyalty? Like, we have these tired old tools, or if the end client has appetite for sort of innovation or refreshing things. So the opportunity is there, but it starts with whatever the agency's kind of preferred way of working and way of doing strategy, but it can certainly evolve, and we do make an impact on these longer sort of relationships that we have with agency clients based on our additive experience. And obviously the more we do this, the better we're going to get, because it's more and more and more and more different agencies we're able to be exposed. We've probably been exposed to 100, 150 unique methodologies just in our 4 years of operating. So it gives you a lot of different perspective. And I know one of Cynthia's kind of best clients that she sort of brought into the mix, Jess's testimonial, he specifically talks about, his favorite part of working with us. Yes, it's the speed, it's the quality, he thinks, we're all nice human beings, but like the pushing and pulling of the strategic thinking that ended up happening as the relationship became stronger.
Yeah, I could imagine that you have to be a chameleon and be able to blend into whatever the culture is at the agency and their work processes. And I think you're right. There's everything under the sun. Some agencies have really strong and defined kind of POV on planning and strategy, and others don't. So I think in some cases they're going to want your perspective and say, how do we do this? How do we even do this? And others are going to say, well, this is our, black box methodology, or how we need to present. Because in the end, that I think that's one of the things that we all have different names for a lot of very similar processes, and it's one of the age-old agency things, is like kind of to create a black box process that is unique to this agency that makes us very different from everybody else. But in reality, what's inside the box usually isn't that different.
Yeah.
So I'm going to guess, because of the flexibility that you bring to your service, you really haven't had any, or maybe very few examples or instances when you couldn't work with a client. Have you always found a way to work with an agency?
That's a good question. I would say direct has been more of a challenge for us. So again, first as sort of a big picture kind of thinker, I was like, wait, what are the potential pitfalls of doing this? And I'm like, well, agencies are going to want exclusivity. So we just kind of, but the first year you kind of have to take something that's thrown at you. Just, and we wanted to we didn't want to get funding or have any sort of debt. So we really were like, let's just take whatever we can from everybody's kind of like past backgrounds and portfolios and see where we end up. And so there were definitely a few things we declined as we moved towards the agency model. We declined some direct brand business or repeat business from we call them direct services clients, because it just wasn't a good fit. They have a very different review cycle and ways of working. Their procurement is completely different than agency procurement. And again, it just felt like a conflict of interest. So we do keep track in our CRM of how many deals we've declined. It's about 10 lifetime, and 9 of those are direct brands, just to kind of keep our focus on agencies. The other was because we just couldn't agree on terms up front based on the pitch. So we don't do pitch work for free. All agencies have a business development budget, whether they'd like to admit that or not, or they should, even if they don't. And we did end up having a situation where it was sort of, hey, let's all work on this, and of course you can work on it if we get it. And we don't have, as a freelance first model, we don't have pro bono hours to dedicate to things. That's not how the model works. So we said, look, we do it this way. It costs X. If you win it, we always offer a small credit, a percentage back on the first invoice. So we do build in an incentive, but that didn't work. So it wasn't like a huge drama or anything. It's just, it's not going to work for us. It's not our model. Every hour that the team makes, with the exception of some internal marketing things every now and then, or admin, it needs to be paid. That's the only time I can think of. But yeah, Cynthia, can you think of, I can't think of any other big,
one of the oh, go ahead, Cynthia.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, the thing about the team that we have is everybody has different backgrounds. So typically, even when somebody's come and I'm like, whoo, I don't really know much about that. Somebody else on the team does. And actually that's been an incredible benefit to me, being, I've been in this business for a long time, and getting to work with people who have different skill sets really closely on a project. I even get to learn new things as a freelancer. So it's it's a very well-rounded team in that way. It's great.
One of the things that has always been the potential downside of working directly for a brand, which is what you say you prefer not to do, is the limitation on the kinds of products and services you can work on. If you work for Kellogg's, if you work for P&G, you're going to work on those brands. Whereas if you work at an agency that has a multiple, very different kinds of clients, that keeps you fresher. You're working on multiple projects, juggling things. As a creative, that was one of the things I liked about working at an agency. Do you find that when you do a project for an agency, whether it's a pitch or whatever it might be, and then you do well, that they say, well, we've got this other agent, with this other client that we're struggling with. Is there opportunities to jump into these other opportunities at an agency?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. There's a ton of organic growth. And I think we're really proud of how often we're either a scope is expanded or continued, or we're rehired a couple months later because maybe one engagement ended, but now they have an opportunity to bring us back again. So we have a lot of clients that we have really long-term relationships with now. And, and it's cool because each time they work with us, we're very thoughtful about who we're bringing into their business. So they're not always just getting the same people every time. It really is dependent on specific need is. Yeah.
Any of these agencies tried to hire you away from your business because they like you so much?
I mean, not as often as you would think.
Okay.
At the very beginning, I would say first year was a little bit different, Cynthia, because it's like, it was so new and everything felt like it was not going to last, right? It was like, oh, we started this thing, but who knows if in 2022 we'll still be here, right? Like, it was sort of like even though I believed it would last on some instinctual level, and I have, I've had started other businesses that didn't have this kind of like trajectory, I think. So I feel like I knew that it was going to last. At the same time, sort of like, yeah, it's the middle of the pandemic. What is time and reality and everything. So I think people didn't take it, not that they didn't take it seriously, but it was sort of like everything was fair game, you know? So, and it was so brand new. So I did get courted by a client, but they were a client that predated the founding. We worked with them both, as a solo freelancer and as co-conspirators. But yeah, not really. I would say if anything, there's probably been more of like eventually, like if you get really big, will we become part? Like I would say the long-term thing would be less probably any of us going to work. I think we're all pretty committed to the freelance life. More like, do we become part of, I don't know, something? Does somebody want to buy us and integrate us and have us be the strategic arm for multiple agencies? I mean, I haven't thought that's a 5-year plan right now. We just want to focus on growth and getting where we want to be and being able to support as many freelancers as possible. But I would say that's probably a more likely scenario than getting stolen away full time. I think folks know that we
I could
really love
tell
this
you,
life.
I could tell you as a head of strategy that when I work with somebody that I like, especially if it's on a freelance basis, the initial temptation is to bring them aboard because it's so hard to find people that you're simpatico with, that are smart, there's a lot of unknowns out there in the world. So once you have kind of established like, hey, I really like the way this person thinks, I want her to be on my team full time. I could definitely see the temptation, and frankly, they probably don't see the other side of like how big your organization is and how, what they just see the face that they're working with in that moment. And for them, they don't necessarily know the scope of your organization.
Mm-hmm.
I do think the team model is a buffer for that too, though, as well, because they're not falling in love with individual people. They're falling in love with combinations of people, to Cynthia's point. So I think that helps protect us. And again, people have left. I mean, folks have left. We've had a few returns, come back. Like, it's not like, oh, every single person, has been here since 2020 and no one's going anywhere. Like, this is a very, and as we scale, we add people. But yeah, I would say the team model makes them fall. Like people say all the time, whenever we hear the word love, it's with the model, not to say people don't love people. All of us, I think, are relatively lovable, but it's like,
I'm
we
not.
get a lot of, yeah. I was only speaking for Cynthia.
People hate me. They like my ideas, but they hate me.
Well,
but yeah, people say all the time, I love the model, right? That's the thing we hear the most. We were actually thinking of putting it like on a shirt or something at some point, So I do think that helps because they're sort of like, oh, I could follow this, but hey, this junior person's really, really strong too. And then it distracts them a little bit from that one-to-one relationship that you can build in freelance. And frankly, I don't love, because I felt like it's too much pressure on one person, as I mentioned before, but some folks still like that arrangement as well.
It sounds to me like you were under leveraging your merchandising opportunities here. So, t-shirts are coming up. Henry and I started this podcast almost 3.5 years ago, January of 2021. Henry was bugging me to do this. And 160 some odd episodes later, we're still here talking about, we're talking about more stuff than the creative brief. Our charge really is creative briefing and advertising. So we talk about a lot of other things, but we always find some way to talk about the brief, or at least I do. So I want to come back to that. I want to, one of the things that I'm sure you are asked to do is to write a brief. Do you have a particular, and maybe not with every project, but I'm going to guess it's probably common. Do you have a particular attitude or a philosophy about writing a brief? Have you got examples you like? Do you have examples that you like to use? Do you have a particular template that you favor? I'd like to hear more about your approach to writing a brief. Or is there someone on your team who is really, really good at writing a brief, like someone's really, really good at making a presentation?
Well, I think Christine's really, really good at the main message. Actually, she has a real poetic side. So and just always is able to nail the main message whenever I'm struggling to articulate it. But I think in terms of approach for the brief, maybe I would say something that I do that I don't know if everybody does or not, but I always go back to the very, very beginning in terms of what's the actual problem that the client is trying to solve, what are our communications goals, I think in a lot of cases, those are sort of overlooked, and there's a lot more focus on who we're targeting, what we're going to sell them. Of course, those are critical, but if we don't start from the right place, nothing ever gets through to the client. And so I will even push back, you know, on the agency side, or try to get a meeting with the client if they're not really sure, because it does happen more times than you would think, that the team isn't 100% sure what the communications goals are, or a little fuzzy on how this all started or what the situation is. I think that is really critical for the creative team to know as well. So anyway, I like to connect all of the dots all the way through, not just the focus on kind of the middle section where I think we all have been trained to spend tons of time. Important.
It's funny that you bring that up, because a lot of times there are projects where nobody even remembers the origin. Like, this thing got on a train at some point and it stopped at your station, but you have no idea where it came from and where it was intended to go. So that's really a great and insightful point.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, as a team, so because we do so many different types of strategy, I wouldn't say a creative brief is part of every remit or every, you know, even engagement, 3-month engagement. We do a lot of social strategy work that often has, I mean, has elements, right, as you're briefing a social creative team, but it tends to look a little different when you're talking about platforms and culture. And it tends to have a slightly, that one, for example, might be more audience focused, right? Because you're really about resonating with a group of people versus something that's a little bit more of a creative inspiration or rebrand. We do a lot of comms and sort of activation stuff, but there are elements that I think carry through all of those because you're ultimately briefing somebody. So whether that's the, you know, creative person, maybe the day-to-day social media manager at the end client, for example, might be using this. So we, you know, we do try to keep a lot of what Cynthia said, and we start, I feel like we all want to start like as end to end as possible. And if we have to shave off pieces because we don't have the, you know, the time allotted, or because it is, let's say, one channel, for example, we will. But I think all of us are pretty like holistic thinkers that start with that sort of end-to-end big picture. Personally, I detest brief frameworks and templates. I like a more free form. Like that's the sort of artist in me. I like to sit down and just sort of think, okay, if I had 10 slides, what would I include in them? And that could be really different each time, but that's not always a reality, as we talked about earlier. A lot of
here, don't we?
A lot of our, that was the type I got actually when I did whatever that quiz was, but a lot of our agencies, as I mentioned earlier, have a template, you know, and they expect there's a brief on a page, right, that we have to do a lot of times. And so we've all become very skilled, obviously, at completing those. But if we had a little bit more free form, sometimes we'll even try to be like Cynthia and I did a brief on a page, and we're like, here's a 5-slide inspiration deck so we can squeeze in a little bit of extra. You know, it's a good exercise to get it and condense it down and be pithy and be short. But I think there's some looseness, I think, sometimes that can help get the juices flowing, especially if a brand is really
It's interesting. It's interesting because we talked a little earlier about like the black box that agencies have to differentiate, and their brief template a lot of times is a window into what that black box is. And we've done like one of the things we do on this podcast is when we're fortunate enough to get our hands on a brief, usually it's a brief that's 10 to 20 years old, if not older. A lot of times the agencies aren't even in business anymore, or they've been acquired, or basically we don't want to reveal anybody's trade secrets or whatever. We want to look at, because we talk about briefs, we want to look at real briefs. But it's interesting because a lot of times they are like windows into the soul of the agency. Like, what is their philosophy on creativity? What is their philosophy on strategy? It's usually there on the briefing template.
Well, I mean, that leads to a question, because you have an insight into multiple agencies because you're working with multiple agencies. Do you see, or what do you see from the agencies where you've done work? And these are some legacy agencies, about their attitude toward the brief, whether it's the template, how they answer the questions. Is there a similarity? Are there vast differences? Do some agencies take the brief more seriously than others? I'd like your insights on the brief from the perspective of the agencies where you've done some work.
Yeah,
without pissing anybody off, just like,
no. There's a huge variation. Definitely some that are very sort of wed to the specific template that they have and want to see it reflected. Others who aren't sure, how to do the brief the best way. I know there's a big agency out there that their brief is not even close to one page. It's mouse type with a ton of information, but actually the first brief that I saw in that case was super insightful, even though it had a ton of information. But I think the other thing that I've noticed is it really kind of can be very client led. So it's not necessarily always just about the agency, especially at a really big shop. There might be some very specific reasons why they're briefing a certain way that are tied directly to the client, and what the client needs and prefers. I worked on an account for a few years where we had to, in our brief, say what the specific message and RTB was going to be in every channel. That had to be attached to every brief, and it had to be then on every creative concept. There had to be a purpose for the creative concept, like in little print at the top. It was a thing with that client's marketing team, and they needed to review things that way. So yeah, it's interesting.
Would you say that was helpful or not in that specific situation?
Oh, it was definitely helpful. Otherwise, there were so many, I think too, like that was a huge account and we had people in multiple offices working on it. So yeah, I think things can get off track really, really quickly when you're briefing 30 people or more on an assignment and you've got, at that time it was like your, brand team, your digital team, your social team, your PR, all of these different teams executing. And let's say you're just giving them the brand brief and there's 5 RTBs, but it's a digital channel. Well, now their digital people are not really clear on what their main, focus should be and what's the social team supposed to be talking about, and how, when you bring it all together, it's just a giant mess. So actually it was really helpful. And so we didn't come to that right away, right? And no one else in the agency on any other accounts were briefing that way. It was just for that one particular client. We had a long-term relationship with them, so it became, our way of briefing for a while.
Christine, do you have any insights on your experience with agencies and their relationship to a brief?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I think Cynthia hit on a good point, which is the IAT type of thing can tend to force more prescriptive, like templated approaches. It's not a bad thing, because I agree, the more people that it gets handed off to, and in the world we're really supposed to be doing social first, shouldn't they be involved at the beginning? But they're not. So any situation where this sort of big idea is getting disseminated and sort of interpreted across a lot of different groups, I do find that a more templated approach that the client has signed off on, that then is used all throughout, all the way through production, is very useful. We do have plenty of growing and sort of mid-sized clients who've been making waves over the last few years, who have fewer other agencies involved. They tend to be AORs for sort of mid-size brands. Maybe they're stealing some larger brand business as well. Those folks are surprisingly very committed to selling strategy. And in those cases, the creative brief doesn't appear until significantly later. So there's a full-fledged real strategy that has components. Maybe it follows a C's, maybe it follows some other proprietary sort of framework, but it's research driven, it's laying the context. Maybe there's some stakeholder interviews, and the object is already in place as a strategy long before the brief comes, and the brief is just a natural sort of spin-off of that. It's sort of similar to a creative brief that people spend tons of time putting together, but I would argue it's sort of a separate step. I personally really love that, and we've seen some of our mid-sized clients say, look, we start with this is our strategy. Everyone's going to be involved, but it's a strategy document. And from there, we will take that upon approval and sort of buy into the overarching strategy, which might include elements of a creative brief. Then we'll put it on a page. And that will be sort of, as we move to account. And ideation of like channels and things like that. So we've seen that a lot more than I would say 5 years ago, when it was very much, we always start with a brief. It's a brief first. There's a little bit more of this other thing that might come first, and it's considered a standalone, sort of sellable object. I really enjoy that because I think it lets you already know some of the answers by the time you get to the brief, which is a process that I prefer, even though we don't always get to do it.
Henry's the strategist. I'm the creative. I used to be a creative director and a copywriter. So Henry's the guy who writes the brief. I'm the guy who executes against the brief. What have you found to be your relationship when you're doing these independent and freelance projects? How do you find your relationship with the creatives when you come in as a freelancer? I mean, it's one thing for a high level, very expensive creative team to come in at the last minute to do a pitch. The teams that are working there saying, okay, we know this team is high powered. Yeah, let them have it. Do they feel the same way about a freelance strategy team, or are they eager to work with you?
I feel competition has gone
Muted,
down,
Henry.
or the oh.
I was gonna say, I'm sorry, I was muted because my dog was barking. I was gonna say that's a great segue into like the idea of rapport, right? Like as freelancers, how important is rapport, particularly with creatives that ultimately are going to be executing off of your strategies?
Yeah, I would say so. We are kind of a save the day service, and I think because of that, there tends to be a lot of like, oh, we're so glad you're here versus why are you here type of thing. And we do, we guarantee a 2 business day turnaround, even for brand new agencies. Like, you come to us with a need, you'll have a team, you'll be onboarded in that short of a time. So you can imagine, not that they're always short term or kind of quick turn asks, but that's often how we start a relationship, and then it becomes a little bit more, there's a little more room to breathe after that. I haven't really experienced that. I don't know. It's interesting. I feel like as a solo freelancer, I've got a lot more competition, maybe because of what you mentioned earlier. Like, maybe eventually I'll come in and I'll become full time, and what's her motivation, and will she, be named on the award, or right, as the strategist, versus like, there's a different kind of focus when you're one person, because we come in as a team, because we come in often because the creative team is asking for it, or the strategy, the small group is like, help. I think there's less feeling of like, kind of egos rubbing in the room, just because what's inherent in sort of our model and the way we do business. We also aren't in it for the glory. We're, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, many of the times we're behind the scenes. So the client may not know we exist. They get to take our work and just package it there as theirs. And that's the model. That's what we get paid for. And we're okay with that. I think if we were all, not to say that all strategists are humble, that's certainly not true, but I think there are some strategists who care a little bit more about the visibility. I would not say, generally speaking, that's the sort of vibe that our team has. We're enablers, not necessarily like the ones that need to take the credit at the end of the day, which helps a lot. I think that comes across. We really are here to help, and that's it.
I think anyone who works in our industry and wants to have their name attached to it is in the wrong business, because, we don't get to sign our work. The way we get acknowledgement is at the award shows. And sometimes those award shows are overblown. Henry has taught me about the value of being humble when it comes to writing a brief, as an example. He's shared with me many times, I never get tired of hearing the story, of when he writes a brief, hands it off to his creative team, which he has collaborated with the creative director in advance, and is completely surprised. And this is rare, it doesn't happen all the time, but occasionally it happens where the creative that comes back is not only unexpected, but better than the brief that he wrote for the creative. And the creative saying, look, we had a different idea. And Henry said, look, if the idea is good, I have to be humble and say, I need to rewrite the brief. I need to address the brief. So what I hear from you is, I think maybe it's rare, but I think it's a breath of fresh air. What surprises me about the nature of this conversation I'm having with you is that, why hasn't what you're doing been done before? It just seems so obvious that a team of really smart strategists who all bring something different to the party can come into an agency environment and save the day. Why? So I want to use this as an opportunity for you to tell us about the changes that are happening at I'm sorry, it used to be co-conspirators and now it's, tell us about,
No,
it's, you've
no
you've
single
had
individual. Yep.
no single individual. So tell us about how your company's evolving and what's happening there. This is your chance to kind of, to be not quite humble, but not immodest. To be modest, but not, bragging. Tell us what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say ambitious, our big sort of audacious goal is to be the only solution that agencies turn to for strategy. We do also have account services. I would say that's a fledgling offering. So I'm not ready to make that commitment yet. It's a very different beast. The account side, it's always client facing. So let's kind of focus on the strategy piece for now. I don't believe that, with rare exception, that solo freelancers in the future of agencies are going to be as successful, not because they're not good, but because this kind of model is much, much more scalable and repeatable. In terms of what we're changing, not really that much. I mean, as I think we were talking about sort of pre-recording, we are looking at potentially expanding the kinds of diversity that we bring on in our mix. So, looking for folks with really interesting backgrounds with both conventional and unconventional paths to the strategy discipline to ensure that we can always sort of make as many great combinations as possible. So we did the math, we have 15 now. That's actually 495 unique combinations. And, we even added 5 more. You think about all the different ways you can sort of put our team together to make that very unique. It's really bespoke every single time for agencies. And I want to be able to scale that if we had 100 people, we're not going to be able to give work to all 100 people. So we're keeping it small and mighty while scaling kind of as much as we can. And yeah, we'd certainly like to, there's some up and coming agencies, I think that we admire, that we'd certainly love to work with, that we've had on the list for a while. So it's probably a goal for the next year as well, is to get the attention of some of the really cool, interesting new players in the space so that we can, go beyond some of the more established agency clients that we have today.
Cynthia, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not to be cheesy, but the sky's the limit. I mean, it is really a unique space, and it is a way to bring in really fresh thinking without having to, as you were talking about earlier, invest in a whole human. In this case, you're getting multiple brains working on problems, and that's incredibly valuable. So I think just as more people kind of get to know who we are and hear about what the offering is, I think we're just going to see growth in terms of the roster.
Well, let me tell you, when I was, announcing on my LinkedIn posts that you were going to be our guest, quite a few of clearly your fans weighed in and said, these ladies are awesome. So I think you've demonstrated that quite clearly and articulately today. So Cristina Olivas and Cynthia Abad Mancheño, thank you so much for being our guests on the Brief Brothers. We really appreciate it. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Ibach. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.